Well, welcome to today's session on alternatives to capitalist structures. I don't know how this ended up on the topics list, honestly. I didn't put it there, but I was delighted to see it. There's so many directions that we can go with this. Pretty much infinite. And initially I was thinking like, well, what are some, like, should we start with, various other forms of government and governance? And realized wanted to drill into the section of like, how do you get to a state of transition between the kind of world that we're in now towards a different kind of world and a different kind of governing structure. And hopefully some of the readings spoke to that. I know we had a lot of different readings, but not so many pages per reading. And so I was trying to look at different visions of what, not only what a future could be, but also what a transition state would be. So there's essentially infinite things that we can go into here. Oh, and is there somebody who is excited about taking notes?
I actually think I am, because I'm behind in the reading, so I would love to take a back seat and take some notes and practice.
Thanks, Brenna, that'd be great. I think I want to open on the question of how do we, given that we can go in so many different directions, and feel free to like draw from the themes if you're lost for ideas, but what are ways that alternatives to capitalist structures or any of these readings feel connected to stuff that we actively work on? Yeah.
I think there's sort of two pieces that have always felt connected to me around sort of like this material and Edgy's work. And I'll just say thank you for pulling, I think figuring out a right slice of like just enough to understand, but like not too much to get bogged down. I think it was like a great presentation of a lot of different things. But so the first one that comes to mind is this idea of like, I guess I think in Federici and like J.K. Gibson Graham's work, kind of like reopening up space for possibility. So I think Federici kind of frames her work as this sort of like historical imagination, or like she focuses really carefully on that transition period to capitalism and to try and understand why maybe it wasn't inevitable and there are other routes. And I think J.K. Gibson Graham sort of do similar work about this concept of economy. So anyway, this is like a thing that I think Edgy does too, is sort of like takes the familiar and kind of like thinks about how we got here to help think about ways to go somewhere else. And maybe I'll just say the one for now, because I could ramble too much.
Is it you or I, Rob? Are we speaking? I can go. I was similar to Don. I was really fascinated by the variety of readings, and also the one that struck sort of what I do a lot of was the one about capitalist economies and kind of like how work was sort of worked out and the history of that and how it has sort of developed over time, and this idea of kind of like market economies and things that are, it's laid out a specific way in the market and also laid out differently in other economics and other like functions of that are equal or more unequal. And I work a lot in an industry that your reputation sometimes matters, or who you know helps to kind of define and get work. And so it was interesting to kind of read a lot of these things where the idea of like work is different in these different societies or organizations, and we're stepping away from that kind of process.
I can also go is, I think that one of the things that we Well, I told Don earlier I spent a bunch of today working on turning our civics discussion into a blog post. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. And it feels like one of the reasons why people don't participate or engage more as citizens, and as people who like define or question systems or otherwise participate, is it feels like, especially in the United States, the way to be a good citizen is to do work and drive the GDP. And it's this very it's this all-consuming drive that appears to be individualistic, that drives powers that we don't understand. It's not even really individualistic, right? Like you're working towards a goal. It's just not a goal that you necessarily understand or agree with. And then at the end of the day, you're too tired to do anything else. And so for me, this is a really interesting topic because I'm very interested to see what it looks like to have, even Federici's idea of wages for housework, like different versions of a life that you might care about living, compensated in some way by the system, or like, if not financially, I mean, ideally you wouldn't need to be financially compensated for things that are important to do. You'd need to be in a system that appreciates them instead. And I thought that I wanted you all to read Cory Doctorow's Walkaway novel in its entirety if you had the chance, but it has a lot of that feeling of people participating in a system, and then this idea that if you just leave, maybe we already have abundance.
Yeah, that was a really interesting excerpt, and I definitely want to read that book because of that idea of just like, it's definitely walk away, or it's definitely walking out in society, but it was like with a purpose, kind of, which was interesting to read about. And I was also thinking, reading that, of like other societies. Like I've been watching there's this TV show called The Orville, which is like this Star Trek takeoff thing, and they don't have this idea of money. You have this idea of like your value in society is sort of like your merit. And it's partially because they can like mass produce everything, so material stuff has gotten away. But it's also interesting to think about that there's no like monetary value in the society, kind of like you're leaving that behind.
Yeah, I guess I thought it was interesting in Walk Away that it was the ethic was more walking away ultimately from like the idea of possessing things, and so that was only a physical act insofar as if somebody wants to possess something, then you can't also be there. But otherwise, it was really a metaphorical walking away, and it was walking away specifically from possession and ownership.
Dawn, you were next. I have a wasp on me. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I'll say first something about Walk Away. I have read the whole book a while ago. And I think I think in the excerpt, I just skimmed it. I didn't reread it. It looks like it starts to think about some of the mechanics of like how post-scarcity like might operate, which I think is like a really interesting thing to explore. It's so like in this idea of like, yeah, remapping possessions so you don't have possessions, or things that you carry with you for a while, or maybe also things that you're okay with if they disappear. But then is there this confrontation between the guy who wants to gamify everything and then Limpopo? I've never said it out that well. And sort of that idea of like, I think it actually, this question about like in a world without possessions, like I think some of it more is like, what are these forms of social cohesion? Like she's like, there's almost like a way that her system of doing work, or that side of it, as opposed to the gamified one, is really predicated on like recentering toward like relationships between people having to be very like deep, and that provides the space to do that kind of work, which I think is so interesting in the idea of like what we think decentralized technologies are doing, and in particular maybe in relation to trust. Or this is my always like my wondering about blockchain stuff maybe. But I actually had a thought that was a step back, and maybe this is just a setup for something I'd like to ask y'all for later. So, I mean, it felt like there was two bits, or kind of two genres or groups of writing. And the first one, like in that walkaway vein, is also Peter Frazee. I'm not actually sure if I'm saying it right. The kind of four futures. And yeah, I'm just curious what people thought about the different futures, or like, or maybe drawing on other ones they've found in sci-fi that like are dealing with some of these themes. And then sort of this other theme, the other kind of like genre or whatever, is kind of like trying to think about structures right now that kind of speak to wanting there to be alternatives. And then I'm super curious in there what people think about sort of these ones that are much more like kind of pragmatic or like transition oriented versus these ones that are much more like transformational. So kind of like these like more incremental versus more radical ideas around how to get from here to a different future, and something I'm super stuck on. So maybe that's like a later question, but maybe as a first question. Yeah, I'm super curious about people's thoughts on the other alternatives that were put forward in the Frazee one, or even just to say more about like the world that is walkaway.
Bryn, did you have a hand?
Sure. Yeah, I haven't done the readings on the four, but I do have an opinion on pragmatic small change versus revolution. And I'm generally sort of naively of the school of thought that sort of more incremental change is definitely the category that I fall into more, mainly because I worry too much about the implications of dramatic upheaval, particularly. And I think that's one of the interesting things to sort of like keep in mind here when we're talking about like alternatives to capitalist structures. Like, it's a phrase that like it's such a big thing, right? Like capitalism underpins everything, and I think it's such a these kind of conversations have like sort of two, they can fall into one of two buckets, right? You can just like be wildly imaginative and go like in a completely different direction, or you can sort of take it with this like, oh my gosh, we're talking about reshaping society, like, and immediately have this very, I feel it has a very paralytic effect where it's like, oh my gosh, like I don't, who am I to be sort of thinking on this level, or who are we? Yeah, and so that tends to scare me very quickly into the small change. But I think that the older you get, the more you realize that like all actions, including no action, is a massive kind of risk. And so there's just like, maybe there really isn't a distinction between really, really, really big shifts and small shifts. They're just, yeah, I don't know, maybe it's possible to, I'll stop there. That was very, very off in the weeds. Clearly I didn't.
I love that, Brendan. It actually ties really directly to a piece that I pulled out of Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy, in the part on creating more possibilities. She has this idea of working towards small changes versus the idea that you can't always work towards a small change. Sometimes you have to change everything. And I think that's, I mean, I was trying to explain in a living room conversation with my parents, like the Green New Deal, and they were like, why are they taking on like jobs, and why the whole climate change, like why zero for emissions? And I was just like, because I wouldn't be excited about it, and neither would anybody else if it was anything less than everything. And like, is it right? Is it going to solve things like, is it going to do justice to the ideals? Probably not, but at least it changes everything. Yeah, Dawn.
Yeah, okay, so I just wanted to say one thing. When you said, like, because it changes everything, I just immediately thought of the International Noise Conspiracy, and they have a song called "It's a Small Demand," which should be our theme song for this episode, because I think the like chorus is like, all we wanted was everything, all we ever needed was everyone, it's just a small demand. So anyway, that as an aside. I'll dig it up and drop it in the chat. Maybe just responding, also there's like this whole idea of just transition, and that was the original language that was used in Canada to talk about, I guess, our equivalent of a Green New Deal, but with the popularity for Green New Deal, they're talking about it now in Canada as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that even the scale of what needs to change is part of what makes me think, it gives me pause about incrementalism, I guess. And so I'll say, as an example, in this context of, like, say, just transition in Canada, you know, like an incremental model means, like, we're gonna spend decades researching clean coal and give provinces the option to do that rather than stop having coal plants. and also, that also is the model that allows, like, the federal government to buy a pipeline because it'll be better run. And maybe, you know, like there's these ways that incremental kind of keeps you on a track, and or it seems like that has played out at sort of like a policy government level. And so I think people who position themselves against that, like, will point to that as not being enough, or that, like, there's these ways that these things need to be addressed maybe at their intersection with another whole set of issues. And it can be hard to do that if those issues have not been historically linked. So by forcing a conversation about jobs and, like, climate, and, like, I think that actually that offers something new that might not come out otherwise than if they were sort of pursued as slightly distinct policy tracks or something. Yeah, and I'll just leave that for now.
Yeah, Brendan.
Yeah, I can't agree more, and I can't be more terrified at the same time. It's a both and to me. Like, I really love that approach. Like, because I totally agree. Like, there's so many things that are just such wicked problems that, like, I just finished a conversation the other day. I apologize for bringing up work, but, like, some other project is building, like, Git for data, and someone was like, why, you know, how are you different from this Git for data thing? I was like, well, you have to go back and you have to redo the whole thing because there are problems that are intrinsically connected that you have to do it all at once. And I think about, like, since we're talking about the Green New Deal, like, talking about the New Deal, the original New Deal, like, you have to. There are many types. There are many categories of problems for which the only justifiable, or, like, the best course of action is to break a whole bunch of things and, like, sort of start over. And that's, and maybe not start over, but, like, I think there's a real question nowadays about how do we engage with that practically, because of, like, I mean, particularly in the US, given the political spectrum, and it's sort of, like, very entrenched sort of side of things. But we could also look at that from the technological perspective, given, like, yeah, there's a million ways to take that up. Gosh, I'm too off in the weeds in this conversation.
Yeah, I actually wanted to bring this back around toward Dawn's question originally about the 4 futures, and I'm gonna, like, read them out just to recenter it. It's essentially, he didn't actually draw this diagram, which would have been super helpful, of 4 quadrants, right? And you've got scarcity, abundance, egalitarianism, and hierarchy. So he named those quadrants. For egalitarianism and abundance would be communism. Hierarchy and abundance is rentism, which I'm going to come back to. Scrolling. Egalitarianism and scarcity would be socialism, which, like, I don't know. I think I need a better personal definition of socialism. and hierarchy and scarcity as exterminism, which read to me as the intentional 1%, 99% type divide. But coming back to rentism, and this this pops up in my mind as really connected to the changing everything problem. Dawn pointed me to a book which I didn't put on the reading list, called New York 2140, which is, if you ever read Mars, it's the same author who does extremely well-researched science fiction. And New York 2140 is a book that eventually gets around to the idea of needing to stop having, well, coming back to actually the reading's definition of rentism, essentially was this concept of IP. So you can make stuff and it can be shared and the ideas can go out to the cloud and such. But in order to make sure that the person who invented the thing gets appropriately compensated within the system, you have to add in this idea that anytime the thing is used, the person gets paid, which seems like it's a good thing that rewards artists, creatives, inventors, except for when you get down to it, then it sort of creates this weird classism. Hi, Kevin. Welcome. Did anyone else have a like looking at this rentism piece and the idea of IP as rentism? Did anyone have a reaction to that? Yeah, Brendan.
Okay, again, I'm sorry, I haven't read it, but the book that I have read that most closely speaks to this is Jaron Lanier's Who Owns the Future, which proposes a theory of how to do sort of like author attribution, basically, at scale. And he sort of like gets this notion of like, yeah, basically says we need two-way links. We need a way to say when I make a thing, everything that uses my thing can link to it and from it. And we need to re-terraform the internet to accommodate attribution at atomical level. And he thinks that like every time you have a thought or somebody, if you're one piece of DNA that you contributed would, if it leads to a genetic revolution or some new drug, then you would be wildly compensated for that because you own that thing. I'm really not a fan. The more I think about it, the more I think it's just I don't know, personally, like my relationship to like making things I don't do things for the sense of ownership. And I think that if we really get down to the reason that we make stuff and the reason that we exist is some attempt to connect with each other on a more emotional plane, personally. But, and so like, I just think building economies around that is overly convoluted.
Dawn, did you have something?
Sure, yeah. I'll sort of just respond to my initial impression reading. Wow, I feel like I have no words today. Impression reading the Four Futures. And also, so I skimmed this article, but I read the book. So I might have a slightly different version of it. I read the book a while ago. It's very short. I kind of saw it as like this walk of like plausibility, which was like, personally, extreme exterminism, that like we don't figure out like equitable arrangements of resources and we in no way address power and hierarchy as like our most likely future in terms of like if we stay on line, like if we stay on like the current track we're on, I see it happening. And there was sort of this like plausibility walk, it felt like to me, through like do we somehow like get to the socialism, which is the like there's still scarcity, but then maybe we have these more egalitarian sort of like forms of society. And that and the rentierism, like both feel like in this space of like next possible outcomes. Like, because it like, it's just like, it's, attenuating down one axis versus the other. Or like change really only addressing one. I would say right now, just being like, reading a lot of stuff that's come out in the last while that are kind of like, it was like that moment where The Economist called themselves neoliberal, and I was like, ah, a moment has arrived. We are in this era where you've like taken up this term which was used to critique you. It's like you've acknowledged the thing that you've been called by academics for decades, or academics and activists. And there's been that as well as like I think a kind of like a acknowledgement around labor, but I think that it's acknowledging it that in a way that is not bringing us towards a better world. Like, so there's like, people saying like, maybe we need to transition to like a 9-hour work week. And that will like address, like some people say it'll like address climate things. And like, you see these think tanks who will also talk about it as being tied to like maintaining economic growth, but like making space for automation. Like there's just this way that people are talking about changing work in society, who are like the type of people who are, I would say, pretty much have no interest in like redistributing power. And I think that like pushes us towards this like rentier style future, and that there are these like types of, like it does feel like it takes off of some very recent patterns. It reminds me Gibson's newest book, I can't even remember the name of it, which I guess is becoming a new trilogy, also has this idea where it thinks about like kind of like everyone gets 3D printers, and they become a place where you can go and like pay someone to print off a design for you, which by the way, there is a platform that currently does that work of like trying to connect on demand production. That's like, the Peripheral. It's like hyper like piecemeal. I don't want to spoil The Peripheral if anyone will read it, so this is all I will say about it, but it's a good read. I mean, I love William Gibson, so I will read anything. But I don't know. So I feel like I am torn, but thinking we actually have a better through line to rentier, or like the rentier capitalism, which I think is what's Marx had this model of rentier capitalism, which is playing on. And I have a soft spot for full-blown luxury communism, but I find that like really hard to imagine. Which is, I think, he means like a specific type of communism and a specific type of socialism, which is whatever. No, I think rentier is, I just think it's likely. I don't think it's good.
Rob, I feel like you've been making skeptical face through a lot of things. Do you have anything you wanted to address, even if it's from a previous part of the conversation?
I have a lot of skeptical faith, but I will confine my comments to the For Futures thing for now, which is I didn't feel like I got a lot out of it, and maybe that's because I am unimaginative. But basically, I've had the book version. I didn't even know there was like a shortened article one. But I have no interest in reading the book now after reading that, because for me, the entire, like the framing of like looking at the four corners of how things could go with some given assumptions is super useful and valuable. But I personally have never been particularly grabbed or convinced by, and again, like maybe this is just me being unimaginative, but particularly convinced by what feels like the major modern like techno-philosophical argument that everything ultimately reduces to intellectual property. In that piece, it felt like was entirely framed around that, and like that just never has like quite grooved with me, and so I felt like a lot of the core framing of that piece was just like for me.
So if not IP, Rob, is there something that you feel like, can you put your finger on something that you think is missing?
No, I don't have a particular other argument either. Just that it doesn't seem clear to me that really you can just reduce everything to the blueprint for a thing. And then everything else is ultimately just the blueprint for a thing. And there's nothing worth possessing of it.
So I shocked myself by putting 0 universal basic income readings on this reading list, though I can recommend a few. Actually, the one I would call out is Raising the Floor by Andy Stern, which is written by a labor organizer who like has this revelation that the robots really are going to take the jobs, and what do we want to happen? It's really interesting. He explores a lot of the different ways that people are looking at changing work, including the reduced hour work week, including like making jobs, and he lands on universal basic income as like the correct way to go, whether or not you dispute his arguments for it. But personally, I think that that's a very, like UBI in general is a very interesting concept, because I think I don't know if it falls into one of these defined futures very well. I guess the first one? Yeah, Dawn, go ahead.
Actually, this was going to be my question to you. I would say my response would be I don't think it does, because I actually think UBI is kind of like a tool, so it's more like a mechanism than it is an outcome. And this actually is the thing that comes up in like people who think more from like a transition literate like space versus transformation, like transition town movement, just transitions. There is like an attention to like the mechanisms, and yeah. So my thought or response to you is like maybe it doesn't necessarily lead to one or the other. And then my ask back to you is like, does it seem like there's some tension in the different motivations going into who promotes UBI? Because I think that the varying places people promote it from is like very interesting. So you talking about a labor organizer being one. I mean, I think the other model is like, like the capitalists, the Peter Thiels of the world.
No, it's super interesting, right? Because you have people who see UBI as a way to not have any kind of other safety net. And that is generally touted as the main way to get the funding for it. Another thing that's interesting, I went and saw a rally for Andrew Yang, who's running for president, and he's running on a UBI platform. And one of the things that he said in his speech was, look, Trump got elected because he identified the problems correctly. But if we could figure out a system where people whose jobs have been taken away, like no longer are in such pain because of that, or have some kind of room to make a transition or shift or something, maybe that solves that problem and moves that voter base. Which is a pretty interesting take, although he's only looking at $1,000 a month, which is not like an income. I also saw something really interesting when I was first looking into UBI. There's a reporter, and I forget his name, maybe one of you will know it, who is funded on Patreon to write about UBI. And one of his things is that he is funded up to a specific level. And then he says, well, that's the metric that I'm fighting for. And so once I hit that, then I'll put all of the overage into other people's UBI Patreons. And what I loved about that was that he had this very specific, like, and that will be enough, which is so counter to the capitalist structure, right? Like in classic capitalism and in like, invisible hand type of stuff, like you're supposed to keep going for whatever you can get. You're supposed to like raise yourself up as high as you can possibly go. And then like seeing that Patreon was like, this guy says that's enough for him. Or if you look at like Adrienne Maree Brown's stuff, like this idea of kind of leaning back on people, or any of this, like acknowledging the idea that you might already be in abundance and then sort of letting go creates this space that didn't exist. Brandon?
Yeah, I find this so interesting because like I hang around way more capitalists than most of you. And I see UBI as this massive extension of capitalism. Like to me, it's just like, I really deeply agree with Don's assessment that like it's a mechanism and it's a really, like if you look at growth-based capitalism, when you run out of, or consumption-based capitalism, when you run out of people who can spend money, you run into real problems. And so one of the best ways you can sort of like keep things going is just give the people money so that they can spend on your stuff. And you can keep the growth curve going at the rate that it needs to. And to me, it's like, that's where I'm like in no way surprised that Peter Thiel ends up on the UBI spectrum, because it's like, we're running out of people who can buy our stuff. We need more people to buy our stuff. So let's make the government pay for the people that buy our stuff. And it's just like, I like so, and I think that Kelsey, you said something really interesting there, which is like that relates back to Don's question. I think of like, we need to sort of ask whether the framing is large enough, and this question of like, what is enough? And like, I think we have that is a cultural definition, right? This cultural definition of ascertaining greatness by some means. I think if we were all competing for money, or if we were all competing for better cars, like it doesn't really matter, right? Like the status symbol is there, and it's sort of ingrained in our culture. And I think that's where we have like I think that's an intrinsic problem that like UBI has very little to say about. I'm not anti-UBI because I honestly think that you could do it the right way, but I think it's a lot easier to have a conversation about taxes and just like, and that's what to me the Green New Deal is really interesting, because like you could just tax a lot more, and now all of a sudden it's a lot easier to sort of put a damper on the people who are outrunning the economy. But yeah, I think it's really interesting how like we can talk about alternatives to capitalist structures, but we can also talk about alternatives to the present capitalist structure, which is just like wildly what like we've gotten off track from like, there's the current incarnation that could definitely be questioned, and I can feel myself slipping into that incrementalist framing again. So maybe I should broaden.
I mean, this is also incrementalist, but like I was thinking about that renting IP thing, and the idea that like the rights expire for intellectual property after a certain point of time. What if it was after a certain point of money? Like, there's a lot of different ways that make things not a subscription service if you just pick a different framing. There's not really any incentive to do that.
What do you mean about certain point of money? Like, this is like, I'm thinking of Philip K. Dick, who wrote that short story. It's so great. Is it Ubik? Where it's like the guy has to pay to like get out of his door. So it's like everything has been turned into a single microtransaction. It's like it is, I mean, you know how Dick is uneven, but it's such a great conceit. Is that what you mean, Leslie? Or no? I don't know what run out of money meant exactly.
Oh, no. What I meant was, like, as the designer of a thing, maybe your intellectual property rights expire once you hit, like, 10 million. Would that be enough? Something like that.
So can I say back? Sorry, I just jumped in. I said it in the chat about why I think maybe rentism is like happening or going to happen. Like, I just think we're actually now in this like decades, like deep miasma of like internal, so intra-country legal structures and then international regulatory regimes that are actually predicated on respecting what ends up being multinational corporations' intellectual property over even the like legal rights and like self-determination and sovereignty of people in those countries. And that started to play out around like environmental issues, but increasingly others. And I think things were clunky for a while in the like early aughts around DMCA stuff, but like they're getting really good at it. And a lot of the like takedowns and like automated, like there's just enforcement mechanisms in like a digitally mediated space that are also getting very good. So I just see a convergence of those. And I think to change that direction is a major dismantlement. Like that's radical. And so maybe I am slightly unsure about. And also, you know, I've like reinforced this, so I should just like check myself. I think that there is not a binary that you have to be either or. And I think there are people who do different framings that think about this, like Amy Donella Meadows on leverage points, ways to intervene in a system. Or even most people who maybe want radical change would like still do the incremental things anyway, right? Like I don't think it's like you can only be one or the other. But I think that things are so complex and interwoven. It's very hard for me to imagine even like what the small steps in isolation would be that would have enough impact.
One thing that I wanted to make sure that we talked about, and this might be a bit of a transition, but the idea of money as a thing that can be converted into anything else. And for me, I think that's one of the foundational tenets of our system is like you can logic it out to a certain extent where things that are valued, you should be rewarded for. And you should be rewarded for them in ways that don't control you. Like the barter system isn't just inconvenient, it's like very limiting, right? So having money as this thing that exists and is convertible into any other kind of money or any other kind of good makes sense in a lot of ways, but also creates these totally absurd, I mean, like, for example, if I go to Southeast Asia, I'm suddenly very much richer than I am at home, or even the absurdity of like buying a really nice dinner versus buying an airplane ticket versus buying a, like, things that really do not convert to one another can suddenly be compared in a really quantitative way. I guess I was thinking about this partly in terms of when I hosted our first decentralized web meetup here in Seattle. Some of the people who showed up were working on Filecoin, and the whole idea was to incentivize decentralized file storage by rewarding you in coin. But it's funny because the decentralized web is this like forming thing, and I have this worry that starting with incentives is maybe the wrong thing. Brendan, then Don.
Yeah, and I find it so interesting how some of these conversations collide. Like if you go deep into the Filecoin GitHub repo, there's an issue posted somewhere about, hey, we should create this new feature that allows you to use IPFS, but then pay in Filecoin to speed up your access to files. And my brain just goes two-tier healthcare system. Like we're in Canada, we've talked about this notion of like, oh, I can just pay for better access to healthcare, and like there's the implications of, and like that debate is in no way settled, but there's just these dramatic implications of like now you have an incentive system that has to flow through a specific form of transaction. And I love the way, Kelsey, you were sort of like contrasting that with barter systems, which seem more limited, but also have a more broad definition of exchange, which I find like the definition of an alternative to a capitalist structure. So I'm all for
it. Yeah, maybe I'll just say, well, I think that money is not always an incentive. I mean, maybe I think that Kelsey, you kind of brought up two points there. And so the first point I was responding to is that I think there's actually been a ton of work kind of like pushing back on kind of this like idea of like on some of the work that money does when it moves in a market. And so like this like classical liberal formulation is this von Mises, like Hayek, but I think Weber is like involved in it. Why money is good is because prices are one of the most efficient ways to communicate information in a market model, which is part of what I was responding to in that, like, I actually don't know if I agree with that, and also it was sort of used as a way to take down like more forms of planning, which, or like sort of like a more socialist model. And I think that's also like a different, that came out of a different era, and I think we should not let that drive the conversation now. But yeah, I mean, the idea of like incentivization, it is so tied to it. I mean, I guess this is the, like my I mean, I think this is a point where like you acknowledge the importance of like that flexibility in some ways, but then think about at a structural level, like kind of like what other levers there are, or what levers are you're working with when you are kind of like needing everything to go back to a currency. So I'm very unsure about the like market mechanic model that it feels like a lot of technology projects are like kind of starting with, because I don't know if markets do all the kinds of are like I don't know if markets are the right way to address all of these problems. And my gut check, and I like totally admit this is a bias, is like that they're probably not for most of them. Yeah, anyway.
We have some folks on the call who've been quiet. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Yeah.
I guess sort of responding to Don's thing about markets and money, and I'm with all you guys who are like bartering, especially when it comes to internet. Like what you're talking about, Brendan, with Filecoin seems a lot like net neutrality, which is kind of scary in terms of, I know in the US now, like Comcast and other ISPs can insert ads between you and your service provider. And it could easily bleed into like paying for access or that kind of stuff. And that's scary in the sense that you're creating pipelines that you pay to kind of play or pay to use it. But in the other sense, money is a good incentive for a lot of people at the moment. And so I think identifying ways to make that work. And in terms of software, there's a lot of companies that will do some stuff for open source and then pay the bills by providing support or higher tiered access, which is sort of like that two-tier healthcare, but it is a way to like support this kind of market while still like providing stuff for free.
Do we have the language to talk about what's wrong with that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, Don.
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. I was gonna say, I don't know. I don't think this selection is maybe the right one to do it, but I think people who did try and think about like that question of like giving ourselves these languages, J.K. Gibson Graham. So they wrote a book before I think they wrote this section, which is called Take Back the Economy, which is actually kind of doing like a redefinition of like what is understood about economy or economic practices. Yeah, so they do talk about this strategy in one of the 3 strategies in that rating of redefining the economy. And I think that was okay. I think their other one, Take Back Our Economy, was a little bit more practical. So what they did was just like profile all of these examples of ways that people have kind of like tried to like make it work in a different way. Which I think kind of helps like unpack some of the assumptions that like are like understood as like, oh, this is always a part of like what we need when we have a way to support like, you know, distinct people making their livelihoods at a distance or like, you know, far away from each other. Like all the reasons why people are like, well, of course, like money's the best for doing that. Like, of course you want a free market. They were like, well, we're going to try building this example that's not those things to help us like unpack those assumptions. But yeah, so maybe it's not, maybe part of the tactic is like to build that language together, which I think is kind of what those projects do. And I'll say maybe that the Commons article offers something as well. So that was like Geo writing along the 7 cooperative principles, which were developed in the mid-1800s, the Rochdale principles. And then Geo is a worker co-op, right? But their whole goal is to like catalyze more worker co-ops. And Geo is an acronym. Like it's like such an overloaded term. I love the word Geo, but it also stands for something. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, that cooperative article is really, really interesting. And I think part of the reason why it was interesting was a very large co-op in Cambridge just actually failed this year after like 25 years in business. And it was probably failed, I don't know, for a lot of reasons, but it seemed like from their frantic emails of trying to get people to shop there that they got squeezed out by Whole Foods that moved into the area. And so it was just, you know, rent was increasing and they were competing with this national chain, you know, that a lot of people shopped at and had a reputation. And so it was interesting to read this article about these cooperative principles that this local institution had and had for a long time in this like urban environment with a lot of people that are passionate about those type of things, and seeing it sort of not work on the ground, unfortunately, due to like markets and the economics of that kind of stuff.
I think that brings up a really interesting point, Evan, of like on many levels, like the criticism of alternatives to capitalist structures is like, well, how it has to be better than capitalism, right? I think you have this like, well, if it's not better out the gates, then it's not truly an alternative, which like, right, like it's very, that conversation feels very faded, right? Like Whole Foods has this massive corporation just juicing money into this operation that like you quite literally have no capacity to argue with. Like if that co-op, you know, poured all their resources in, like Amazon has every incentive to come in and just add whatever figure that they put in plus some percentage. And so like I think that when we talk about alternatives, it can often be a very frustrating framing where it's like it very much feels like the electric car versus the combustion engine. Like it's a Herculean lift to come up with something that performs at the efficiency of the current incumbent process. And that can be really frustrating.
Brendan, what's the, why do you think that startups sometimes succeed where mega companies fail in the same area?
Do you want me to consume the rest of the call? My favorite answer is by exploiting a strength and making it look like a weakness, right? By, you know, obviously I sit at the table of the Red Hat version of this, which was like Microsoft had a lock hold on the operating system, and the only thing that Red Hat could offer you that Microsoft couldn't offer you was control, right? And they published every line of source code, and so you could change the bug. You didn't have to wait for somebody to ship. We didn't have to wait for someone at Microsoft to ship a fix, and that combined with what I believe is a barter economy, funded by a lot of other people, allows you to compete at scale, which is really interesting. But I think you need that magic combination of some departure, a paradigm shift that also maps onto a familiar metaphor, which is really, really, really difficult. And why I'm also frustrated by the fact that in our startup world, we throw thousands of these companies at these problems. And they're mainly, as Don made an allusion to, the inherent complexities of these systems. It's so driven by timing and luck and funding and all of these things.
Don?
Oh, I just wanted to say it was a really interesting framing that I think it would be probably supported by, or that, like thinking it that way would be something that I don't think some of these people writing would disagree with. What I would ask, or like what I would like maybe probe is like, it almost seems like this idea of like you have to be so much better to succeed if you're not capitalist or not, like pursuing an alternative. I mean, just thinking about like what path dependencies exist right now to support certain types of experimentation. Like like that ecosystem to allow this like Silicon Valley bubble of like entrepreneurship and failure. It's also like these people who get to fail up into like another company. That's great. I would love to be a CEO. I would love to be able to fail that big that many times and keep getting more money every step along the way. Sometimes. I think it's really like what is the I don't know how to say this. I guess my thought is like, and I think this is a little bit what Federici does, and maybe J.K. Gibson Graham in some of their like broader work, is like kind of doing this, like looking at, man, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not being good with my words today. Like they're trying to like reopen these things that have been naturalized or like been normalized, and like can like then asking us to start there instead of like start at the point where we are working with all of the operating assumptions that make certain pathways possible. And I think even Michelle Murphy's like work, it's funny I just had to say her whole name, in like the economization of life, and I think a lot of other feminist scholars, and not just feminists, have like pointed to this way that like it's a lot of fucking work to like keep capitalism going. And I think about that a lot because I also am so disheartened that it keeps going. So I'm like, why does it take so much work? Does it keep going? And how do we think about coordinating otherwise? Anyway, so yeah, Brendan, I think it's a really evocative point.
And hopefully this is building, like, I want to point to a really obscure thing here as an alternative. In Canada, we still have this concept called the Bravo Fact or Much Fact, which are standing grants to make a music video, and which sounds ridiculous, but I want to contrast that very briefly with the Silicon Valley Chance to Fail Up, where you have this like sort of just pool, right? Like, and that's what VC money is at the end of the day, right? It's just like handouts to go take a kick at making something successful. But the Canadian government actually gives up to $20,000 to new Canadian artists to produce Canadian content, because we have a cultural mandate in Canada to produce Canadian content. And out of that has shaken Drake, Justin Bieber, Celine Dion, like stars, Broken Social Scene, Arts and Crafts, a recording label, like an incredible sort of like Canadian music scene that I'm like deeply proud of. And but it's also, it is a very similar government mandated simulation of a place where it is okay to fail, right? Like the vast majority of those music videos that get made, I worked on a bunch of them and they were really bad. But every now and then somebody turns out something wonderful. And I think in so many ways, like it's not a capitalist system, it's cultural production, right? Like it's just, we want a Canadian national identity. And so they just fund it outright. And so maybe it's just this opportunity to fail that's the thing that we really need to hone in on. I don't know, reminds me a lot of academia.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And it's kind of the opposite of the thing I was thinking about in response to like Dawn bringing up wages for housework. And I feel like with Airbnb, Federici got there, but it turned out to be late stage capitalism. Like this ties in so strongly, Brendan, with like this idea you're talking about of startups hitting a niche where like, well, like think about when people first started driving, like not now, but when people first started driving for Uber or Lyft, or when people open their houses at Airbnbs, they don't think of it as a job, or they think of it as a job with extreme freedom, or they think of it as just some extra cash. Versus like, I've done a lot of Airbnb hosting, and like per hour, I am not making nearly enough to spend time changing that many sheets. That is not interesting work. That is not like, it feels like you got a lot at the end of the day because you get a payoff, but it's like, it's not even just the changing of the sheets. It's the communication, it's the care, it's the vetting of people. It's making your house perfectly clean all the time. And if you have housemates, making them make it clean all the time. And it's just like, no, wait, apparently you can pay me to do that. But why? Yeah, Don.
As like a parallel example. So like, yeah, maybe that's a moment where you see like, yeah, here's a way that that type of labor gets paid, but like it gets paid in a system that individualizes it and still hides the labor, right? It moves a site of production closer to you, but while still figuring out how to hide that as reproductive labor in some weird ways. Yeah, maybe people figure it out eventually. But also, like, you know, in Toronto, there's been a lot of Toronto Star reporting on it, and I don't know why they decided to coin their own term to talk about it. It's like, great, why don't you just use the same words that everyone else was using around the world to talk about Airbnb? And you know, most of the people aren't hosting in their own home. Most of the people are managing multiple listings and actually paying someone to do that labor. Like they have inserted themselves in that slice, right? So they don't even do the labor anymore of the most popular ghost hotels in Toronto. But my other example, and this is sort of a weird one, but it struck my mind, is that there's this brief moment, I guess, in around pre-World War I, where Vienna was run by like hardcore socialists. The period is called Red Vienna. And they built all these like child creches, and like they actually re-architected the city along like a wages for housework line, because they wanted like women to not have to do all this unpaid labor. So every apartment building would have like a communal laundry and baths and like child creche areas where people were paid to do that work. And they did that like fucking 100 years ago. So I just think that, I don't know. I think it's like a funny, like, so that speaks to a collectivist, you know, example as opposed to the individualist Airbnb ones.
What do people think about like gut reaction to the concept of wages for housework? Or expanding from housework to like the broader emotional labor type of stuff? Like, how does that feel to you? Yeah, Kevin?
I would be supportive of it. I just have no idea how it would be implemented. I don't know enough about it, but it makes a lot of sense to me. That's all.
Don?
I mean, I think part of what it does is like point out like some absurdities around how the system of production works, right? But just even the campaign. But I think my thought about it is both like, heck yeah, but also that I would hope, and I kind of think this was the intent, that the act of trying to actually realize that would require such a transformation of society that we wouldn't be in a system where there's like this individualized wage labor. And so I don't know if I would want to live I don't know if I would want to live in a world where, like, say everyone had their own personal time tracking app and they tracked every single thing they did all day, and that there was like some way that you got paid for reproductive labor and it was accounted for. You know, like I could see dystopic implementations of it, I guess.
I mean, I have a pretty strong negative gut reaction to the idea of getting paid for emotional labor or housework, like care work. Personally, like, I feel like you should do it because you care. And that's complicated because that is the other side of the argument, right? I guess I'm also in this position where I'm like, also the other work you should also do less because of money and more because you care. And we're not in that world. So it's kind of it doesn't make sense in our current framing.
Kelsey, I sort of feel like I hear you articulating for like there are things that should sort of exist outside of the bounds of the economy. Like we should be pushing things farther away from the sort of like more rigid system. Does that feel fair? Like, because I think there's a question of like, what is the scope of capitalism? Like, can we just like contain it a little bit and then have more things that exist outside of it?
I don't know. Actually, I might be thinking of a completely money-free system where there's just abundance. I mean, it's interesting to have both me and Kevin on this call because we both work for Edgy for money, and then also Kevin volunteers for Edgy and I don't. And like my gut reaction to that would be like, well, a person getting paid probably doesn't care about it as much or comes to work for a different reason. But obviously that doesn't have to be true. It just often is true in the general workforce, I think.
I often wonder too, sometimes if money is, besides a motivation, if it's like an identifier, it makes people realize the value of something, unfortunately. So it's like, yeah, maybe it's not great that, you know, all these people are getting paid like a lot of money or a little money or whatever, but at least if they, you know, you see how much they're making for the work they're doing. And if that was somewhat more fair, and I don't know what fair is, if that's money or if that's something else, maybe I think that would help in their emotional labor thing. And maybe it's what Brendan says, where it's like, that's out of a capitalist economy. You know, maybe they're valued some other way besides like a monetary return. But in the short term, at least, money is a good, like, hey, we recognize that you're doing a hard job or you're doing something of value.
Yeah, Dosh.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say one more thing about like the motivation behind the campaign, as I understand it, is like there's two extra pieces which make me think it's really important. One is like this work is already getting done, and it's getting done by you know, I think she talks about transnational like circuits of like care, where it's like women from global south countries come and do care work in people's homes, and like that in some ways that is remunerated as labor, but it's not treated as like formal like labor in the same way, so it can be exploited. And so by like bringing all reproductive labor under like this like notion of like work, forces like addressing that. And then also, so that's sort of like one thing where it's like there's types of already paid care labor that are being, I think are that those are still exploitative like work relations. And then the other one is like where it doesn't even get considered work, but that it is actually totally necessary for people to do work. Like that's what, so reproductive labor is being a requirement before there is productive labor. And so it's kind of like a saying like, hey, like this shit is actually a requirement for like the world we're in to actually be operating. And it's sort of like, let's not allow this system to externalize this. You know, similar like to like maybe environmental costs or something.
Rob?
I think maybe I just want to tie that back to your point, Kelsey, about you and Kevin both getting paid, but treating your involvement in very different ways. Because it makes me think a lot about, this is still very edgy specific, but our trials and tribulations with attempting to pay for people to do work on web monitoring. And that interesting nuance between paying somebody to do work and compensating somebody who did work, which like there's a whole lot in there, and the difference is both subtle and not. So like I think, for example, we've tried, my idea early on was to like use the money to pay people to do work, to make sure that like somebody was doing the work, and that mostly pretty much failed. And you could, you know, it's not that was necessarily a failure as an idea, but it requires a certain kind of treatment and has a certain kind of results. And so now there's all this discussion about maybe trying to pay me, and the only way I can frame that in a way that doesn't feel bullshit, that works for myself, is that I'm not being paid to do work for Edgy. I'm being compensated for the amount of time I'm putting in for Edgy anyway. which is a really different way to think about it. And I think comes back around to that sense of like, in what ways is the work, is the money or the capital that some different way that's maybe less trade based, or is it really, if it is for trade but not quite, like I don't know, but like that set of thoughts and set of nuances has been spinning in my head for the last couple of weeks.
I think that's really interesting. I think there was a quote from Marx, and this is a much more negative take on that, but in the Weeks book, the quote is, "One consents to give the other his or her labor power for a limited period of time, and in return the other agrees to pay the first a specific amount of money. But to see what happens after the employment contract is signed, the analysis must now move to a different location, the site where the special commodity will be, quote, consumed. The activity of labor and the social relations that shape, direct, and manage it will be revealed as the locus of capitalist valorization." I think that that's a really interesting, like, it goes from being a barter to a giving of power, sort of how, like, indentured servitude is not the same as having paid with money, or there's something in there that speaks to this concept of doing work that you would not have done without incentive, the work that nobody wants to do, except for that is so directly at odds with this is also from Weeks, this concept of, like, not just, what is it, Puritan? No, it's the other one that starts with a P. Protestant work ethic, but also like this very modern concept that your work should be your passion. You should love what you do and also get paid very well for it. And that's what success looks like. Yeah, Rob?
Has anybody on here read or listened to The Real World of Technology by Ursula Franklin? Super worthwhile. I regularly buy copies of it so that I have some to give away to people. It explores a lot about the idea of framing technologies as sort of control-oriented versus work-oriented, or process-oriented versus like holistic. Yes, her Massey lectures. And like there's a lot in there that's interesting about like how do we frame technologies, whether they be money or like other physical tools, around like is their use and value to direct people in doing things. And very often that can be framed around like, oh, this is a way to like make sure that like the drudgery gets done, versus what would a world look like if everything that we built were framed around being a tool for use by people to like holistically do a process. So the idea of like how can the tools like help somebody do all parts of the thing and make the drudgery less, as opposed to like how do we use the tools to control people to make sure they do the drudgery, which is a like I always think that's a super valuable and super interesting framing around this stuff, and very worth reading if you haven't.
Yeah, I think that really goes towards the question of like the robots taking over the jobs, and the question in the back of my mind that says, well, wait, is that a bad thing if you assume that the jobs aren't necessary and the people get taken care of by their society? Like, should we want people to want to do drudgery? Don?
I mean, I don't think we should. I'm super mindful. So in Alberta right now, I think there has been acknowledgement from conservative people, conservative thinkers. I don't think Kenny in particular, because the UCP is in their own bubble. But that, like, look, all of these jobs that were lost in the most recent economic downturn in the oil patch, most of them are not coming back. They have really changed how that work happens. Some of the office jobs might come back, especially like the exploration side of stuff, because of all the production cuts that are put in place and sort of like those companies not pursuing exploration opportunities because of the price of oil. So basically there's this situation where like a lot of mostly men between the age of like, I guess 19 to like 29, so up until 30, who maybe didn't go to school, but were working in the oil patch, have like been out of a job, and maybe out of a job for a couple years now. And it's like it is a significant cut to the amount of people who are doing this work. And the jobs aren't coming back. So all I would say is that I think it's not so straightforward an issue as like, maybe we don't want people to do this like maybe dangerous or like this drudgery work, because work is so bound up into so many other ideas of like our identity, our role in society, and et cetera, et cetera. And Weber kind of talks about it in the selection that you had from the Weeks book. And I just think I don't see anyone talking enough about that in the conversation around automation. So I'm just sort of scared with like rote automation and that those other parts not being attended to.
I want to highlight that there's only 2 minutes left, and I don't think we have anything we need to address other than this discussion in this discussion. But if anyone has been holding on to an idea, this is the moment. Kevin.
I just wanted to bring up, I've been trying to help with the stewardship readings next week, but so I might need help there if people want to lend a hand. And then I don't think we have anybody signed up for the decentralization. So, because I think initially Matt Zed was volunteering to do that, but he hasn't. I think he might be in Tibet or something now. So, just wanted to bring that up, make sure that we're aware.
Yeah, Brendan.
Yeah, on that point, I'd be happy to sort of like first try and find somebody to talk about decentralization. I think it'd be really fun to reach out. There's some other folks who like are around and might be really fun to see if they could take some interest in leading, but it's a bit of a long shot. So yeah, I really enjoyed working with Eric to do the first set of readings. I'd be happy to take another crack if others don't have time.
I think it'll be hard for me to help with stewardship just because of where I will be. Kevin, though, I think I had originally said I would be able to. So I could try. If you want some reading help, I can do a pass. But I won't be able to help with anything, I think, on the day because with time. I'm actually not sure if I'll be able to attend.
Yeah, that's okay. Actually, reading help would be the best. I talked to Kelsey, and she said she could help facilitate. And I reached out to Justin Shell and Michelle Megahertz for readings, but they haven't had time to respond. But if anybody has anything to recommend, that'd be great. But then I think Kelsey and I can.
Kevin, I put some reading suggestions on the issue. I don't know if you saw them.
Oh yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I did notice, the comment you made about like if we're talking about also like not just data stewardship, but more like care, ethics of care. I think that makes a lot of sense to include that stuff too. So it doesn't have to be just data stewardship, but just stewardship in general.
They're the same thing in the end, right? I think it's 4:01, so it's time to wrap it up, or whatever time it is where you are. Thanks for joining, everybody. Enjoyed this conversation. And
Thank you so much for facilitating, Kelsey. It was really great. And like I do have to point out, like Kelsey put in way more legwork than like the average. And so I am very thankful. I'm definitely going to go back and look through this list.